Hi, Pokey the Bear here. How's it going? Day 2, I guess, of my blog. But I got all the notes written for this fantastic journey that we're about to take. So this is the Night Circus. It's a fantastic book. When I first discovered this book, I was in high school, and one of my English teachers gave it to me. She said that she thought I would enjoy it. I wasn't really one for fantasy or magic books when I was younger, but I think that this book in particular, it speaks to everyone's soul on some level. There is some form of magic in this book for you. Now, before I begin, I'm going to tell you that the summary of this book is essentially, it's about a circus. The circus only comes at night. There's no warning as to when it comes, where it comes. That's all the general public knows. Other than the circus is in entirely black and white. Like the whole circus, there's no color. The patrons, of course, have colors, but the people themselves in the circus are only in black and white. The whole entire canvas, everything is in black and white. Now, for me, that in itself is another thing, that it's just so magical because it's monochrome, I hope I use that word right. Let me know if I ever don't use a word right, because I'm learning too. Everybody is always learning, and we should always be bettering each other with the knowledge that we learn. But in my experience, it is a monochrome circus, only in black and white. There's shades of gray too, but it's majorly black and white. Now, this particular book is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. Sorry, I mispronounced her name on my first video. That drives me crazy when people mispronounce my real name, so it's Morgenstern, not Steen, Morgenstern. The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. And this particular copy is the first Anchor Book edition, published in July 2012, copyright 2011 by Night Circus LLC. I'm telling you that specifically so that if you yourself have a copy and wanted to follow along with what I was doing or saying, you could. I am going to say spoiler alert because there is a lot of spoiler alerts. There might even be trigger warnings in some cases in some of my videos, and I'll try to let people know, but in reality I don't know what's going to trigger you and what's not going to trigger you because everybody is different. I have triggers, but you just take a deep breath and get through them. It's a hard world out there. So, I'm going to start with the circus arrives without warning. The Cirque the Rêves, which means the Circus of Dreams. So this whole entire circus is called the Circus of Dreams. And if you start out on page 7, we start out with a quote by Oscar Wilde, which there are quotes throughout this book, usually from the characters in the book, but Oscar Wilde was a real person. He said this in 1888. A dreamer is one who can only find his way by moonlight, and his punishment is that he sees the dawn before the rest of the world. Now, this book is broken up into several parts. I actually meant to write down how many parts there were, but I think it's 4 or 5. That part's not really important because once you start reading the book, it's really hard to put it down. This is the 3rd time I've read the book. And this specific time that I read it for a person. I usually read them for people. The book comes back into my life, and I have a feeling I have to read it for a specific person. The person I read this for his name is Kitty Cat. He's a very magical man. I would call him a magician myself. But I read this book for him. And I'm making this video kind of for him because he's not a reader. He'll never read it. But I know if he read it, it would literally change his whole world and how he sees perspectives on everything, because he's a magician, and this book would if you like magic, if you don't like magic, if you like circuses, if you like contortionists, if you like anything about the circus, read this book. Don't even watch the rest of the video because I'm about to tell you the entire story. But if you don't have the time, then follow along. So, particularly, this book jumps around, and it starts in 1873. I never actually followed the timeline until I had to make my notes, but it does jump around a bit, so sometimes it can be hard to understand what's going on. So it opens up in 1873 in this theater. There's a really great magician. He's the Prospero the Enchanter, which, by the way, none of the people in this book are based off of real people. So you may be like, oh, it's Alexander the Great, or it's this or that. No, none of this. It's all fictitious. All of it is fictitious. The writer herself was a magician in writing this book. It's very original of a read. But in 1873, it starts out with this performer who is a magician, obviously, and a little girl is sent to his quarters. She's got a suicide note pinned to her coat. This girl is his daughter. She identifies as Celia Bowen. And the magician, we actually learn is named Hector Bowen. And this is how it starts. He's meeting his daughter for the first time, and he's reading this note from this woman that he obviously had an affair with or some sort of fling with 5 years ago, which resulted in this child. The child ends up having magical abilities that her mother feels come from the devil himself. And Hector thinks that's funny. But he sees the magic in the girl because while she's standing there, like, in tears because she's meeting her father and he's not being an emotionally supportive, like, hugging you, like, oh, I love you, you're my long-lost daughter. He's just reading for the facts. He doesn't really care about the emotional aspect of this little girl. And while she's sitting there, she starts shaking a teacup. And the teacup, like, shatters. And she wasn't touching it. Nothing. That's how you can tell that she's magical. Well, it starts out in New York. The other thing I really like about this book, it's really not original, but it's unique in a way because it uses a lot of French in the book. Not in the actual book, but there'll be like a French word here or there, and you can tell it's French, and you can look it up, and it's real, and it's legitimate. Like, all the tarot card readings, all of them are done in French. Like, the cards themselves, you don't know what card it is unless you know French, or you have Google right there to look it up. But later on in London, Hector introduces Celia to this man, whom she identifies as a man in gray. And he is identified through a lot of different names throughout the book. A man in gray is really common, Mr. A.H. But she calls him Alexander, and she's like, why is he identifying as Alexander when that's not his real name? So we never actually find out his real name, but for intents and purposes right now, we're going to call him Alexander, because that's what he's identified with as the name in the very beginning of the book. And later on, you know him as Mr. A.H. So Mr. A, Mr. Alexander. But he meets Celia and Hector in London at this one of Hector's performances. Celia's now 6. And Hector has this proposition for the man in gray, for Alexander. He goes, this is my new challenger. Like, do you have an opponent? We can challenge them. And there's no real explanation as to the challenge. But if you're paying attention as a reader, you can tell that one of the opponents in this challenge isn't going to make it. Like, one opponent survives. That's how the challenge goes. One opponent survives and only one opponent survives. But Hector wagers his daughter's life with this man, and he must find his wager and test being who is a better teacher at magic. That's essentially what the challenge is. He takes the ring and he binds it to her hand, and Celia, at the age of 6, it leaves a scar on her hand that will never go away. The pain never leaves her from this binding, because that's how binding works. If you know anything about real magic, that's how binding works. When you get bound to something, you're bound to something, kind of like marriage. And that's essentially what this challenge is for her. At 6 years old, she gets bound to a challenge instead of a man, which in the 1800s, it would have been. They would have been arranging an arranged marriage. But instead, it was a challenge. Now, then Alexander says, because they're talking about where the venue of this is supposed to be. And Alexander says, I know this man, his name is Chandris. Now, Chandris is a very eccentric man as you learn throughout the book. Very different, very unique. I really enjoy Chandris's appearances in the book because he's clueless, absolutely clueless to everything that goes on around him. But I feel bad for him near the end. But the man in gray says that Chandris will be perfect for designing their venue. So without further ado, Alexander goes to an orphanage, of course, in 1874, and he adopts a boy. Later on, we learn that this boy's name is Marco. This is what he identifies as. But Alexander insists to the boy that it is absolutely unimportant as to what his name is. So we'll call him Marco, as that is what he is called in the book. But magicians don't really believe in names. They think that they're essentially just handles. They're how people will call on you. Now, he adopts a boy from an orphanage in 1874. Becomes his pupil. He introduces him to magic and learnings. Now, through 1875, Celia is growing up all over the globe with theater and culture. Meanwhile, Marco is growing up in London in an empty house with no emotional support at all. I mean, neither of them have emotional support at all. But the boy is essentially like, he was adopted, he was put in this house, and now he just lives here. And there's nobody ever here. He just always has what he needs to be taken care of. He grows up in London, and he's just constantly reading. Alexander shows up all the time with books and lessons. Celia, on the other hand, is getting informal, spontaneous, very studious studies. Her father will cut her fingertips open and force her to heal her own fingertips over and over again. In fact, at one point in time, he broke a bone in her arm, and she had to heal it herself with her magic as a young child. Versus the boy, he just learns anything he wants to out of the books. Like, he just reads constantly. And it's very obvious that they have different learning techniques. And you hear about those different learning techniques as you read through the book itself. Now, Hector insists that he's putting all of this pressure on Celia with nothing in her best interest except winning. That's all he cares about. That's all you ever really hear him talk about. The things she's doing that are going to make them lose the battle. So, on page 33, it says that people see what they wish to see. And in this instance, Alexander is talking to Marco, and Marco has asked him why can't people tell the difference in these magicians that are performing? Like the ones that are real and the ones that are just stage magicians. Because he sees the difference when he is shown the performances, but he's also reading a lot of magic books. Like, he's understanding the actual concept of real magic. But Alexander responds to the boy on a regular basis that people see what they wish to see. The crowd doesn't see the real magician because they see the cages that the birds are actually in and whatnot. And at this time, the boy becomes bound to the challenge. So he is a teenager, and he is a little more in the understanding of what's going on. Not exactly, though. They never actually understand what's going on until near the end. The only two people that actually understand the whole challenge in your eyes would be Alexander and Hector, and yourself, of course. But the boy, of course, is very optimistic right now. He's like, I wonder what my life is going to be. Like, this is a wonderful life to be in. But he's an orphan. But he lives a decent life. You know, he was adopted from an orphanage in 1870 whatever. And that's a big thing, you know. That's like the Oliver Twist times. Kids got adopted. It didn't matter what they were doing because they were better off being adopted. whereas Cecilia, on the other hand, is represented as heartbroken and weak, but you can tell that she's not. Like, neither of them are. They're just not given the proper emotions to be growing as children should be growing. So we flash forward to 1884 when Marco is 19, and he loses his notebook, his sketchbook, in a cafe in the rain in London, and it's terrifying because it's got all of his charms in there. It's got everything he's learned that he's felt is important for this challenge that he's about to be going up against. And he runs into this woman who identifies as Isabella Martin. Now, she's a very important character in the book. Very important character in the book. But she kind of falls in love with Marco. Like, right off the bat, she's in love with him. She's aware that he's a magician. They end up going to another cafe so she can give him his sketchbook back. He finds out she reads tarot cards. He shows her a real magic trick. Like, a real magic trick. Taking her to a place that doesn't even exist by just, like, holding her hands and kissing her. Breaking the impossible. As he declares, nothing is impossible. Hector, on the meanwhile, is selling Celia as a psychic, and she's hating it, hating every minute. Her lessons are becoming even more and more violent, and he's constantly abusing her to force her to use her own magic to heal herself. 1885, Marco starts to work for Chandris, who, as we are aware, is building the venue that they are going to be challenging each other in. And this is when we go to page 58 and we learn about the circus. This is the first. I'm probably going to read every single circus description room in the book because that's the best part. And if you're not going to read the book, at least you got to hear the descriptions of the book. These are all original, written by the author herself, Erin Morgenstern. So page 58, almost all the details are worked out, and we've got the circus almost up and running now at this point in time. Darkness and stars. With your ticket in hand, you follow a continuous line of patrons into the circus, watching the rhythmic motion of the black and white clock as you wait. Beyond the ticket booth, the only way forward is through a heavy striped curtain. One by one, each person passes through it, vanishing from sight. When it is your turn, you pull back the fabric and step forward, only to be engulfed by darkness as the curtain closes again. It takes your eyes a few moments to adjust, and then teeny dots of light begin appearing like stars, lining the dark walls in front of you. And while moments before you were so close to your fellow circus goers that you could have touched them, now you are alone as you feel your way tentatively forward through a maze-like tunnel. The tunnel twists and turns, the tiny lights providing the only illumination. You have no way of discerning how far you have gone or which direction you are moving in. Finally, you reach another curtain. Fabric that feels as soft as velvet beneath your hands, parts easily when you touch it. The light on the other side is blinding. So I'm going to take a break at that moment, and this will be the first part of the video. It might take a few more posts because there is still, we're only 58 pages into the book, and there's still a lot to go over. But hopefully you're enjoying my spark notes of the book. Let me know in the comments below.